This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. By this point, you've probably heard about the tens of thousands of last-minute flight delays or cancellations that have been happening this year. Maybe you've experienced one yourself. I know I have. But what you may not know is that these cancellations are a result of old problems within the aviation industry that are just now boiling over. Problems that date back decades, which COVID then turned into a crisis. And all of it has led to the industry-wide pilot shortage we're seeing today.
Major carriers have the planes, but don't always have the pilots to fly them.
Airline passengers in the UK have been told to expect delays to continue as staff shortages cause chaos.
COVID absolutely knocked the airline industry on its side. It has contributed to this pilot shortage that exists that airlines are now working very hard to recover from.
Now, airlines have faced similar shortages before. They first saw a major hiring freeze and job cuts back in 2001. The September 11th attacks grounded flights across the country. The industry wasn't profitable again until 2006, and during that 5-year period, the losses grew to over $60 billion. Over the next decade, airlines weathered bankruptcies, mergers, and of course, the Great Recession in 2008. By 2018, 4 airlines controlled about 75% of the market, while many others shut down. Airline employment still hasn't recovered to its peak in early 2001, and pilots, as you may have guessed, are not an easy role to replace.
You have to get 1,500 hours of flight experience, which starts as becoming a private pilot. Then you get other pilot licenses. It can take approximately 3 years, maybe more, for someone to go from no experience to getting the experience they need to become an air transport pilot, and can cost $100,000 or more in training.
As new pilots still go through years of training, older pilots are aging out of their roles. The Federal Aviation Administration mandates retirement for commercial airline pilots at the age of 65. That law was passed in 2007 to move the limit up from 60 to 65, hoping to make up for the shortage at the time. There's already been discussion of moving it again, but Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg has stated that isn't the Biden administration's focus.
The answer is not to keep the baby boomer generation in the cockpit indefinitely. The answer is to make sure that we have as many and as good pilots ready to take their place, to have a stronger pipeline.
For the pilots that are in the air, covering for the short staff has taken its toll. To meet the sudden urge and demand for travel over the last 2 years, airlines have been overscheduling flights that they just don't have staff for. Pilot unions from both the US and abroad have raised alarms over burnout and fatigue. For example, several European trade groups publicly criticized the CEO of Hungarian airline Wizz Air for discouraging staff from calling in sick because of fatigue.
We are all fatigued, but sometimes it is required to take the extra mile.
So the FAA requires pilots to have a minimum of 10 hours of rest a night between their last trip of the day and their first trip of the next day. And so the pilots who are working say that they are working longer hours, they are tired, and they are concerned about fatigue. And that is legitimate. You know, you don't want a tired pilot getting behind the wheel of the controls of a plane.
Unions are hoping the shortage will help pilots secure higher wages and more protections against things like burnout. For example, major German airliner Lufthansa just saw a major strike just this week during a dispute over wages. Pilots and ground staff organized a mass walkout, which caused thousands of cancellations on Wednesday. And meanwhile, in the US, these talks have been dragging on for years. The negotiation process for pilots is unusually complicated, and it's very difficult for pilots to legally strike in the US. The federal government can prevent strikes and labor disputes that would interrupt interstate commerce, and that includes transit workers. So the pilot shortage is far from a quick fix. It's the result of a perfect storm of factors, and the fallout from COVID exacerbated the crisis. From the initial billions in losses and massive job cuts, to the sudden rebound in demand, to the thousands of airline staff members catching COVID during surges. But now that industry problems have trickled down to consumers and caused widespread flight chaos, there might finally be some momentum to address the roots of the problem.
And you have many parts of the air transport industry that are all working to rebuild themselves. It's not just Humpty Dumpty that has fallen off the wall and is trying to put himself back together. It's a whole carton of eggs.
While this might not be an overnight fix, airlines are finding creative ways to train and hire more pilots. This means rethinking how airlines train, hire, and recruit new applicants. Joining us to tell us more about what's changing is Newsy correspondent James, resident pilot Packard. I'm just giving you a new nickname, who has a couple of pilot licenses himself. James, thank you so much for joining us.
I got a promotion.
I know. There you go. Can you walk us through some of the ways airlines are working to get more pilots trained and hired?
Yeah, I mean, they literally can't get them fast enough from the normal pipelines. They have relied traditionally on like regional carriers and the military to send them pilots with enough hours and all the certifications that they need to start flying these big commercial jets with passengers loaded on them. And they can't get enough that way anymore. So they're literally establishing their own flight schools, Christian, to pump people from almost no flight experience or none at all to ready to fly a commercial jet. They're doing that at United Airlines, at Alaska Airlines, at American Airlines. It's amazing. You've never seen it before in the industry, and they're all starting to do it now.
Tell me about the pool of applicants themselves. I mean, most pilots are within the same age group, same demographic. How are airlines kind of expanding that and diversifying the pool of applicants that are coming in?
Yeah, traditionally, pilots that are coming into an airline are somewhere between the age of 22 and 26, sometimes up to 30 or so, having gotten some flight time in the military, if you will. But those tend to be wealthy people who had the access to an education that would give them all those certifications, which is almost cost prohibitive to do. It's so expensive to get that done. On top of that, right now at United Airlines, for instance, the cockpit is basically 70 to 80% white male, 70 to 80%. United is trying to change that. We actually went down to their flight school in Arizona a couple of months ago, and the student body at that university that they've established there is 70% women or people of color or people of color. So that's going to change their demographic in 10, 15, 20 years in the cockpit, but it's going to take a lot of time for them to get there. The nice thing is that they are able to do that in a contained environment, get scholarships to people who wouldn't otherwise have access to that school, and change the demographic of their cockpit.
I mean, I'd be remiss to not ask you about some of your own experiences. How long was training for you when you kind of went through your own bit of pilot's training?
Yeah, so I am one of these people who comes from privilege, right? So I had access to a flight school where my parents helped me pay the $250 an hour it was for me at that particular school. At 14 years old, Christian, I started flying, and it took me a very long time. Of course, I eventually went to college and ran out of time and money. So I'm not exactly the picture of how quickly you can get it done. But we're talking about for a private pilot's license, which just allows you to fly a single engine like Cessna. That's going to be $8,000 to $12,000, depending on how you do it. And if you really commit yourself to it, you can probably get it done in 6 months to a year. But a lot of people take longer than that. On top of that, to fly for an airline, you need an instrument rating, which lets you fly without looking outside the airplane, just relying on the instrument in front of you. You need a multi-engine rating, which is exactly what it sounds like, and air transport pilot certification, a commercial license. You got to get trained on a specific type of aircraft. And you have to have, say, 1,500 hours is currently the minimum to get hired at an airline. 1,500 hours, that takes a really long time to accumulate. So you're talking about a minimum of 5 to 10 years to actually have what you need to get hired at an airline. And for many people, that's something that they don't have the time to do and don't have the money to do. And it's one of the reasons I'm sitting here and not in the cockpit of an airplane.
One of the things I've always said is that, ITL is for the kids. So if children are watching right now, I hope you're calculating exactly how much money and how much time this is actually going to take, because it's a good little bit, man.
Yeah, it's a great dream to have. But if your kiddos are sitting out there staring up at the airplanes and going, how cool is that? Redirect, get a soccer ball or something, redirect.
Right. So one last thing here. One of my questions for you is, what's the likelihood we might be able to get something like that from you? You calling in from a cockpit the next time you come on our show.
You want to come out to LA and shoot that? And the two tallest guys who are on Newsy's payroll can cram into the little cockpit of a Cessna, and we can pretend like that's comfortable and doable. As soon as you work that out, we'll make it happen.
Not willing to do that, but if you ask me to come out there, there's absolutely no way I could say no. So Newsy correspondent James Packard. James, as always, thank you so much, brother.
You bet.